It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear.
So? Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to episode 223 of Science on Top for Sunday the 24th of April 2016. I'm Ed Brown and I'm joined by Dr. Shane Joseph.
Hello.
Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And composer, sound designer and writer Peter Miller. Welcome to the show.
Hello and thank you for having me.
Great to have you on, and tonight we're going to be talking about why those Dyson hand dryers might be kind of nasty, which I'm sure is a big surprise to everyone, and how bats plan ahead when they're hunting. But first, Peter, have a listen to this.
Keep coming up with love, but it's so slashed and torn. Why?
I think we might have just broken a few windows for people listening. That, of course, was David Bowie and Freddie Mercury. And now, Peter, there's been a new study published this week that looks at the vocal talents of Queen frontman Freddie Mercury. It turns out he had a very extraordinary voice, didn't he?
Indeed. Well, he does. Well, he did have a very extraordinary voice, and you don't really need science to tell you that. But this study that has been published just recently is, well, you know, pretty much just looking at Freddie Mercury's voice, despite some of the headlines you might have seen come down your social media feeds that claim that science confirms Freddie Mercury was basically the most amazing singer of all time, as one of them said.
Wow.
But it really is. It's an interesting study. It's just really looking at Freddie Mercury's voice and his vocal style. It was done by a fairly disparate group of researchers from the Czech Republic and also from Sweden, which seems like quite an interesting kind of country mix there. And really, as they say in the abstract, the purpose of the study is to conduct a viable analysis of publicly available data in order to arrive at a more empirically based insight into Freddie Mercury's voice production and singing style. So they're not really about...
do that?
Yeah, well, sort of. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's pretty much what they did do. They provided some data to tell you that Freddie Mercury's voice is extraordinary. It's certainly not, you know, confirming that he is the most amazing singer of all time. But they looked at his voice, they looked at his singing voice and also his speaking voice from various recordings, some a cappella recordings and some album recordings of his music. They studied the fundamental frequency of his speaking voice, which is kind of a guideline to what kind of singing voice someone has. And then they analysed his singing voice parameters and looked at things like his phonation, which is the way he pronounces things, the timbral qualities of his voice, his vocal range, which is said to be quite extraordinary, his vibrato, and a technique called vocal subharmonics. And as a sort of a side effect thing, they also looked at the vocal fold behaviours of another singer doing an emulation of Freddie's vocal style. So that's kind of what they were concerned with looking at, and they did indeed come up with some data that showed various things. His vibrato was unusual because it's a little more rapid than isn't general kind of average vibrato in trained singers.
So what does that mean? What's vibrato?
So vibrato is a technique that a singer uses when they trill their voice. There's a kind of a wavering sort of effect. And not just singers either. I mean, violin players, any kind of expressive acoustic instrument generally uses vibrato to give you that kind of nice, you know, sort of mellow, wavering sound. Freddie uses it quite a lot, as do many classically trained performers. So they looked at that. So they were just basically measuring in the recordings that they were looking at. They were measuring the rate of his vibrato, that is, how quickly he wavers the sound, and then just comparing it to some previously known rates of other singers. and just finding that it is a little quicker than most people. Subharmonics is another thing they looked at, and that's a technique whereby the vocal folds or the vocal cords are actually relaxed to such a degree that you can create a harmonic tone on top of the fundamental tone, or along with the fundamental tone. And Freddie Mercury, this is a thing that you may be familiar with when you hear people doing harmonic singing. Tibetan monks and Tuvalan throat singers use this technique to give different harmonics on top of or underneath the fundamental tone of the vocal cord, and it's quite an eerie effect. And but it has to be learnt. It's not something you can kind of do subconsciously, really.
Can I just ask? Can anyone do it? Can anyone learn? Or
yeah, you can learn how to do it. It's a learnt singing technique. Most singers who do it have to develop a very relaxed. You have to relax your vocal cords very much to do it well. So it's a definite training thing that you have to do, and people learn to do it. So anyone can learn to do it, but it's as much a training thing as any other vocal technique, really. And Freddie Mercury doesn't use it typically he doesn't use it as a melodic thing. It's really to accentuate a sort of a roughness in his voice, it gives a sort of a strange kind of I don't know. It's very hard to describe it. It's a roughness. It's a kind of a growl, if anything. So they looked at that, and they actually interestingly found another singer who they taught to, or they got to emulate Freddie's style, and stuck an endoscope down his throat while he was singing, and then took photographs of what was happening, or presumably movie footage, in fact.
That strikes me as a bizarre thing to do, like to be able to sing and to emulate Freddie Mercury's voice while there's a tube down your throat.
Yeah, it can't be easy. But it is a known thing among vocal researchers. They do that. I mean, so it's not unusual by any means to have a look at what's happening with vocal cord and actually film it and see what you can find out from vibrations and stuff. So they did that as well. And the findings of what they had, what they did. Well, really not findings. I mean, they're basically only interested in just providing data. So they, as I said, they said his vibrato was rapid compared to many singers. He does use subharmonics. His range is large, but they were unable to actually say that it was the 4 octaves that are often claimed of Freddie Mercury, which is a very large range for a man, 4 octaves. But they said that there wasn't any good evidence to suggest that, because it's very difficult to tell. A lot of studio tricks used on Freddie Mercury's voice, particularly in the earlier albums. So, to try and say definitively that he could sing a 4-octave range is a pretty hard thing to do.
Right, but they're not saying he didn't have a 4-octave range. They're just saying they are unable to ascertain.
That's correct. From the material that they had at hand, which was the a cappella recordings and looking at his album work, they were unable to sort of definitively say, yes, Freddie Mercury's got a 4-octave range.
Sure.
But he may well have. I mean, he could sing very high. Really, it's the lower frequencies that are an issue, because he's a baritone and with falsetto, so he's actually singing baritone up into falsetto, and then singing down lower is probably where it's harder to tell whether he could actually go low enough to make 4 octaves.
Yeah, I read one article that described him as a baritone who chose to sing tenor.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, his range is well up into the tenor range. I mean, he can sing without question in the tenor range. So it's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment for a voice. There's no question. We know that from listening to Freddie. I mean, he's an amazing singer.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you were saying to me off the air was that the really interesting thing about Freddie's voice is not so much his range or the vibrato or anything like that, but how he can change from his regular singing voice into that falsetto with very little sort of adjustment period, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, they don't actually talk much about his falsetto in the study, which I thought was interesting. They do mention it, but they don't say much about it. But he's an extraordinarily good falsetto singer. And a lot of his work is in falsetto, especially if you go back to the earlier albums like Queen and Queen 2 and Sheer Heart Attack. There's a lot of falsetto singing in those albums, and they don't really say much about it. But what he was able to do, which is quite difficult, is to to go from his normal singing register in the upper register into his falsetto without making an audible transition. It's what's called eliding. So he actually went from those higher notes in his normal singing voice into falsetto and without no seam at all. And that's very hard to do. Women are typically better at doing it than men, but it's hard because you have to actually reconfigure the way your throat is kind of singing and your vocal cords are singing.
Yeah, there's a singer in a band that I'm quite partial to called Merciful Fate, and King Diamond is the lead singer, and he was very well known for his very creepy falsetto, but he had this very sort of mid-range. He had basically two vocal patterns: a mid-range kind of sneering delivery, and this very high falsetto. But it was obvious that he would shift between them. Whereas, you're right, Freddie Mercury seemed to sort of slide between them. Yeah, and there was
very good at doing that. And it, it's an example of very, very fine operatic training. You can't do that kind of thing without good training.
Yeah, a lot of the articles that I read also said that Freddie apparently turned down the opportunity to work with opera singer Montserrat Caballé, which because he felt that I think he was known for being a rock singer and he didn't want to sort of change his image or something, which I thought was odd because he did work with Montserrat Caballé and did the Barcelona.
And arguably some of the earlier work that he did was incredibly operatic.
Yes.
I mean, he sort of transitioned into a much harder rock singer in the later albums, but certainly those first three albums, there's a lot of. I mean, it's overtly, hugely operatic. And you even in Bohemian Rhapsody, you can tell incredible.
Bohemian Rhapsody is a rock opera.
Yeah, indeed, that's right. So it doesn't seem likely that he was kind of that embarrassed by it.
Yeah. All right, very interesting stuff indeed. But let's move on and talk about bats. And it turns out bats are really, really good at doing something I'm really, really bad at. They can plan ahead. And a new study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science shows that when hunting insects, bats don't plan one kill at a time. Penny, they often choose flight paths that take them to two victims in quick succession, don't they?
Yeah, which I find quite amazing. I used to play a computer game like back in the 80s where you were an air traffic controller and you had to manage multiple flight paths. And I think just doing that to think, okay, I'm going to catch this one and then this one will have moved somewhere else, but I'll just fly around and catch it to where it's going to be after I've caught the first one is quite a complex piece of calculation. And I know that there's a lot of really complex things that we can do or that animals could do without, consciously working it out, like catching a ball. If you think about all the calculations you're going to do to do that, it's quite difficult. But bats, I don't think of as, the really smart kind of animals. So, I mean, I guess I don't really think of bats at all. I don't think of them as really clever predators, but they are. So bats aren't blind, but when they hunt at night, they do rely on echolocation. So they're kind of like a submarine. They send out a sound, and when it echoes back, they can use the time that the echo took and its volume and so on to build up a picture of what's around them. And so as they get closer and closer and closer to their prey, the echoes become quicker, becoming what's called a terminal buzz. And would be, I don't know if the organisms they're hunting can hear these, but it would be quite scary, I think. Anyway, these beams are directional, and this research has found that bats can actually focus their beams, their echolocation beams, on the two nearest bugs. So not just the one that they're going to catch, but the next one they're going to catch as well. So this was done by setting up an array of microphones to listen to the calls. So what they've found by listening to the calls and analysing them is that the bat can approach two targets. So it designs, it plans how it's going to fly based on the movement of two different insects which it's tracking with their echolocation. And they've done this. They've looked at almost 800 bat attacks.
Whoa.
And yeah, which is a big data set, especially as I'm guessing this is kind of like using a bit of computing power to turn this into a 3D flight path, because The bats
Sorry, does that mean that they're actually using two different insects to kind of like locate themselves and the other insects? Is that what you're saying?
No, they're tracking where their two closest insects are, and they're planning like a flight path, like a zooming thing that will catch both of them.
Both of them, I see.
And they're anticipating where that.
They're anticipating where the second one's going to be as they still go for the first. Which is a bit smarter than I gave a bat credit for, to be quite frank.
Yeah, well, I'm guessing when you were doing your video game in the 80s, that was probably a 2D thing you're talking about. This is going to be in full 3D. There's going to be going up and down.
Up and down.
And only using echolocation, not using sight.
Yeah.
Yeah, echolocation.
But you were explaining the study that they did. They had microphones and they were tracking
the calls, reconstructing the flight path, and seeing that basically as soon as they grab the first bug, they get to the second. So they're immediately able to, they don't have to go, okay, I've caught the bug now, what's next?
Well, not even chew.
Yeah,
presumably
basically.
they just swallow it whole and then go get the next one and swallow that.
You better hope that the first bug's not really big. Because
well, maybe they even take that into account.
Yeah, I guess.
It's very impressive talent, and I think even more impressive that you can actually study this. Like, presumably it's out in a forest somewhere. It's not like you've got your little small enclosure that you're doing it in.
Yeah.
But, very cool, very impressive. Now, Shane, there's nothing glamorous about workplace or public bathrooms at the best of times. But a new study looking at the high-powered hand dryers, in particular the Dyson Airblades, has found that they can spread a lot of virus particles. Shane, should we all just wipe our hands on our trousers instead of using the hot air dryers now?
Or, just shake them around a bit. That'll be fine. Yeah, look, well, first of all, in response to this study, Dyson got very, very, very uppity and essentially wrote a reply saying this is basically scaremongering and, we've conducted studies, etc., etc. But looking at how the researchers set this up, it seems fairly, well, it's pretty convincing on the face of it anyway. So I'm sure we've all seen those Dyson Airblades. They're really cool. I really like them.
They're fun to use.
They're really fun to use. And they actually dry your hands, unlike most hot air dryers, which basically just sort of, you pull your hand out from a minute later and they're still wet. And you're like, well, what the hell was the point of that? And also, there's also sort of a people regard them as more environmentally friendly because you're obviously not creating paper towel waste.
Yep.
And there's a big attraction in that. However, these researchers did a bit of a study and they wanted to see, do these hot air blowers, especially Dyson ones, actually blow out more particles and, spread more contagion theoretically than just normal drying your hands on paper towel. So the way they did this was they took two researchers and they basically covered their hands in the equivalent amount of a virus, which was a harmless virus, by the way. It was just a virus that infects bacteria, but it's a model for normal viruses, and they covered their hands in the equivalent amount of someone who would be basically diseased or have some sort of diarrheal viral infection. And they made them dry their hands with paper towel, they made them dry their hands with a normal air blower, and they made them dry their hands with these really cool Dyson Airblades. And to test how much...
Not all the same people. I'm presuming there's a control group and different...
Well, yeah, one after another, yeah, different times.
Yeah.
They also... So they basically spread out agar plates that are covered with a thin film of Escherichia coli, which is the natural host of the virus that they'd spread on people's hands. And the way that you can measure virus infectivity is if you spread like a thin layer of bacteria across the agar plate, which you can't see, but it's there. If you drop virus particles on that, when the E. coli grow or the bacteria grow on the plate, there'll be little plaques or clearing zones where the viruses have infected a cell, burst the cell, gone to infect the next cell, and the next cell, and the next cell.
Okay.
So yeah, it's basically like little sort of not holes in the agar, but just sort of clear spots on the agar where you see where viruses are. So you can that way you can count how many particles landed on that plate.
Okay, you're essentially counting the bodies, the corpses of the bacteria, sort of.
Well, yeah.
That's how I want to imagine it.
If you want to imagine that way, if that makes you feel better, yeah.
It does.
Yeah, cool. And they spread these across like a height, 6 different height zones, sort of measure, mimicking like a child's height to an adult's height. And also they spread them around this bathroom, or, this mimicking bathroom in various distances. And they found that Dysons actually caused 60 times more plaques than a normal warm air dryer, so your old school blowy one, and 1,300 times more than paper towel drying.
Right, because that's obviously paper towel's not going to spread any at all.
No, hardly anything. Maybe a 10 centimeter radius as opposed to, and it makes sense when you think about it, because Dyson Airblades especially, the pressure that is pumped out of air is basically it's quite mind-boggling. You feel it on your hands, and I can imagine it's sort of just basically buffeting things around, and the wind force there would be quite phenomenal. So it doesn't surprise me when I think about it. I mean, I've always sort of fallen for that idea that maybe it's a bit more hygienic than paper towels, but when you think about it, no, probably not. especially if we're talking virus particles. Now, I mean, but apparently bacteria being spread isn't so much a problem, but it's virus particles definitely, because virus particles airborne can generally be infectious.
Yeah.
So obviously, normal, especially with Western health, you're not likely to spread horrible pandemics with this. But there's still a bit of a public health concern if you're worried about not spreading diarrheal diseases or things like that.
Oh, yeah. You just need to have someone with norovirus or something, and then everyone in the workplace will get sick.
Pretty much, yeah.
And so
I gotta say though that I saw this thing, and the first thing that I thought when I saw this come up in my feed was, I wonder who is responsible for this research. And I had a look at the main researcher, Keith Redway, and it turns out that he's actually pretty pally with the European Tissue Symposium. And these people, what do they make, do you reckon? They make paper towels. They make paper towels. And so, those things kind of bother me when I see this. And you probably know that this feud has been going on for a little while specifically between Dyson and the paper towel companies. So I don't know. I look at it and I go, yeah, I guess they're right. But presumably when you actually go to the toilet and wash your hands, you don't have these viruses on your hands.
And that is the crux of the issue. Because if you're washing your hands properly, there isn't really a problem.
Yeah.
But most people don't.
Yeah. Well, and that is, of course, true too. I mean, But then the other problem with that is that, when you wipe your hands with paper towels, very frequently they're still wet. So then you go and open the door of the toilet. Mm-hmm. So someone else is going to put their hand on that.
Yeah,
I don't know. I am sceptical. I remain sceptical.
And that's why germaphobes always prefer toilets with push doors that they can use their elbow or something rather than use their hands. But, it comes down to washing your hands effectively, no matter what the method of drying, I think, which is interesting because also this week there was a study that looked at the two main ways that people are taught to wash their hands. So there's the Centers for Disease Control method, which is a 3-step procedure. Step 1, apply hand sanitizer to one palm. Step 2, rub both palms together. Step 3, rub product all over your hands until dry, which takes about 35 seconds. And the other method they were looking
that's not soap and water, right? That's
correct.
Sanitizer.
Right. You're right. I should have said that up front.
I think you did. I was just clearing that up.
No, this is for your antibiotic hand sanitizers.
Yeah.
So that takes 35 seconds. They compared that with the World Health Organization's recommendations, which are 12 steps and take 42.5 seconds. I don't know if you really want to go through all 12 steps, but they're wet hands with water, apply enough soap to cover all hand surfaces, rub hands palm to palm, right palm over left with interlaced fingers and vice versa, palm to palm with fingers interlaced, back to the fingers to opposing palms with fingers interlocked, rotational rubbing of left thumb clasped in right palm and vice versa. It goes on.
I mean, like Penny said offline, off the show. If this is fine in a hospital, and this is what you'd expect of someone who works in a healthcare, everyday use, especially considering that most soaps that you get in commercial bathrooms, most commercial soaps that you find in public bathrooms are actually pretty filthy. Like especially especially the squirty stuff, you know, like there's actually stuff growing in those things.
That's a sobering thought.
I'm pretty sure we did a segment on that a few years ago. There was, or I read it somewhere. Anyway, continue.
Well, basically, they found the World Health Organization method is better than the CDC method. But they are both not very good, and certain antibacterial soaps do more harm than good, because there's obviously the antibacterial resistance issue. There's problems with using chemicals like triclosan, which are environmentally unfriendly, and you're much better off just using good old hot water and soap and washing for at least 30 seconds. And I think doctors and surgeons will wash for at least a minute or so before going in. But that's the upshot of it, is be very careful. Use soap and water if you can, and for at least 30 seconds. And then don't use a Dyson Airblade. or do, really. Maybe, depending on whether you believe the Tissue Symposium or Dyson themselves. But
I do remember that there was in one of an old gym I used to go to, there was like a Dyson Airblade, like a copy of one. Not a real one, and that thing had a pool of dank water in the bottom of it. That never went away.
No. And it's kept at a nice warm temperature.
Yeah. I was always a bit funny about using that one.
Yes, but thank you, Peter, for doing the due diligence and looking into the researchers who did that. I wasn't aware that they were linked.
It was Michael Marshall. It was Michael Marshall's kind of, that prompted me to do that, because he does that stuff where he says, look, we're looking at some kind of thing that the Daily Mail is doing, and I wonder who's behind that. And I just have this thing now. Whenever I read that kind of study, I go, I wonder who's behind that.
It's a very, very important question to ask. But yeah, I think that's about it for the show. And as always, we'll have more information on all the stories we talked about today at scienceontop.com/223. And you can also find our social media links, ways to get in touch with us on that website. And you can send us an email, feedback@scienceontop.com. And don't forget to jump on iTunes and leave us a review or a rating. That helps us a lot. Thank you for another great show, Penny and Shane.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, Peter Miller, for joining us. Where can we find you on the internets?
I have a blog that looks at kind of weird soundy things, which is called hummadras.com. So if you're interested in pseudoscience that happens in the audio world and all that weird stuff, that's where to go. And
we'll have a link to that in the show notes. This episode was edited with unrelenting diligence by Marcos Benemu. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
I do my best to stay clean. And so I was a little overwhelmed recently when I saw the World Health Organization released this new guide to hand washing, a guide that is 12 points long. 12 points. My hands only have 10 points. And I really don't think it's that complicated. I mean, just listen how proper hand washing can be summed up by actual physician and definitely not a plumber in a suit, Dr. Manny Alvarez.
The WHO is reminding everybody because, they want you to get into the groove of properly washing your hands. I call it making love to your hands. You gotta make love to your hands. You have to make love. You have to sway your palms. You have to interlock your fingers. You have to rotate your thumbs. You have to make love to your hands. Then you got the technique.
Yes, you have to make love to your hands. And if that's true, I was extremely hygienic in high school. But